Hello and welcome to the American Journal of Psychiatry Residence Journal podcast. I'm your host, Neil Christopher. On this episode, we have a special interview from Dr. Aaron Winkler interviewing Bloomberg columnist Joe Nocera of famous podcast The Shrink Next Door. And he's also interviewing a psychiatrist and ethics expert, Dr. Mark Komrad, as they discuss the ethics of doctor-patient relationships, boundary crossings, and violations. This episode comes with two caveats. First, you may want to go listen to The Shrink Next Door. Second, it will be released in two parts to give you the full interview, one this week and one next week. Here we go.
Okay. So, hi, everybody. My name's Aaron Winkler. I'm a psychiatry resident at the University of Maryland Sheppard Pratt Psychiatry Residency Program. I'm a PGY4. I have worked with the American Journal of Psychiatry's Residence Journal, written a couple articles for them over the past few years, and this year am an outside editor, doing outside reviewer, doing reviews. And so it's through that association that we get to do this podcast for psychiatry residents across the country. The topic today is the ethics that we see in this podcast, The Shrink Next Door. So there's this podcast. If anybody out there hasn't heard this, doesn't know about it, I'm going to probably say this a couple of times over the course of this time. You got to go listen. You got to go listen to this thing. I mean, it's the story of a treatment gone very wrong, and it's not only interesting but also entertaining, and it really keeps you listening. So again, it's called The Shrink Next Door, and we're lucky enough today to have the man behind that, Mr. Joe Nocera. Hi, Joe.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Glad to be here.
So would you be willing to, I guess I should, but before we get into I want to introduce our other guest. Is that, so we have another guest, Dr. Mark Komrad, who is a psychiatrist who sees patients. He also is on the APA Ethics Committee, which is a national group that oversees ethics and the ethics code for the APA, for the American psychiatric profession as a whole. For 20 years, he was the chair of ethics committee, the chair of ethics at Sheppard Pratt, which is a private psychiatric hospital here in Maryland, one of the top private psychiatric hospitals in the country. He did peer review and ethics review for the Maryland Board of Physicians and teaches and lectures on ethics. So he's taught me a great deal about ethics, but he also is invited to go around the world to talk about specifically physician-assisted suicide. He's sort of a world figure in that field and has talked to national governments and done all kinds of stuff in that realm. So we're lucky to have a sort of a lay expert and also a professional expert to have a conversation about how things can go wrong, what happens when things go wrong, and how we as psychiatry residents can try to not do that.
Thank you very much. Mark Komrad here. Really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this remarkable case, looking at some fundamental issues and the doctor-patient relationship and boundaries through the lens of this remarkable story.
So maybe we should start with the story. Joe, would you give us a brief synopsis?
So I'm an opinion columnist at Bloomberg. Mostly Bloomberg does short-form business podcasts. So this was the first time that Bloomberg had ever done a long-form narrative podcast, but both Bloomberg and Wondery, the podcast company that was the co-producer, just found the story so unbelievable. And it is unbelievable. The story very quickly. I moved to a summer house in Southampton, New York in 2010. I was under the impression, as was everybody in the neighborhood, that the house next door was owned by a big shot New York psychiatrist named Ike Hershkopf, who was a figure of some repute in NYU alumni circles and also in Orthodox Jewish circles. I went to one of his parties. He used to hold 3 parties a summer. And I also had drinks with him and his wife one night. And when you walk into his house, or that house, it's just festooned with photographs of him with various celebrities ranging from Brooke Shields to O.J. Simpson to Henry Kissinger to Elie Wiesel. The idea that this would not be his house is just not plausible. So meanwhile, at the same time, there's this little schlumpy guy, usually dressed in the sort of green uniform of a caretaker, who is working on the property and is helping out at the parties and who's inviting me over to meet his boss, as he called him. And his name is Marty Markowitz. So fast forward to the summer of 2011, suddenly the psychiatrist is gone. And Marty Markowitz comes over to my house with a woman And he says, Joe, I want you to meet my sister Phyllis. I haven't seen her in 27 years.
And you already had a chance to talk to Marty before that?
No.
Or was that the first time you'd ever met him?
No, it was not the first time I'd ever met him, but it was the first time I'd ever met him in the context of not working for Ike Hirschkopf.
Sure. Okay.
So then he goes on to tell me that the house was never Ike's, it was always his. And that he had never been the caretaker, per se, although he'd acted as one. He'd actually been a patient of Ike's for 30 years. So at this point, I'm completely flabbergasted, and I want to know more. And over the course of the next, I would say, half a year, as Marty grew more comfortable with me and began to show me more things, I learned that Ike had co-signed his Swiss bank account when he had one back in the day, that he had willed his Hamptons house to Ike's wife, that they had had a foundation together, in the course of which Ike had put in close to $1 million. Marty had put in close to $1 million. Ike had put in close to $150,000, but the vast majority of the money had been spent on Ike's causes, many of which were these celebrity-studded parties, celebrity-studded dinners where Ike would pose with the celebrity and Marty would actually be there with a camera to take the picture.
And so we've got a psychiatric patient whose money is gone into a philanthropic fund that the psychiatrist is now dispersing to charities to get himself expensive seats at expensive fundraisers so that he can get close to celebrities, where the psychiatric patient is acting as photographer for the psychiatrist.
That is correct. All right. And then there's one other important facet. Ike also became a quote unquote consultant to Marty's fabric business, eventually had himself named president of the business, although he never took a salary or anything, and continued to take a sort of hourly fee kind of thing, or it was more like a monthly fee because they had a different kind of arrangement. But eventually, Ike's defense would be that Marty wasn't a psychiatry patient after all. He was actually a business client because Ike had a business consulting firm on the side, although I should point out that he did not use his real name in this business arrangement. He called himself Isaac Stevens.
And didn't he have that name on the house that was really his patient's house?
That's
on the
right.
Mailbox?
That's right. And he would say to people that it was really the house was owned by the company. That was one of his excuses. So that and by the way, this went on for 30 years. You know, it began with Marty being at a moment in his life in his early 30s where he's a very, very vulnerable and troubled soul. Ike, this is what got me. Ike would only been in business practice 2 or 3 years at this point. He was a young guy, and he says to Marty, he says, "Don't worry, I will take care of your problems." So it's not like he says, let's talk about it or let's think about it or let's work through it together here in psychiatry. He says, I will take care of it. And he almost immediately steps outside of the four walls.
Right. It's not about help. How can I help you to make you stronger? It's
right.
I'm going to be your strength for you. And then I'm going to use that to take your strength away.
Right. He would say, you're not good at confrontations. Your clients are eating you alive, which was sort of true, actually, because Marty's father had died and he had been thrust into the position of running the company. And he was psychologically ill-equipped at that point in his life to do that.
Which is why he's going to a psychiatrist.
Exactly. So Ike says, I'll be the bad guy. I'll be the bad guy. I can handle it. You can't handle it.
So he's going to the clients of the company, acting as the bad guy on behalf of his patient so that his patient doesn't have to do that.
Exactly. And he even gives the patient ultimately a fake office name so that they make believe that Marty has actually left the company. It's bizarre.
And then after that, it sort of continues. And when we get lectures about psychiatric ethics and about, sort of treatments gone wrong and one of the things that you hear about is this idea of a grooming process, that people are going to be abusers. It's a lot like a cult leader.
Very much so. And Marty has said on more than one occasion that he thinks now that he was in a cult. I should note a couple of quick things. First of all, although Marty is the worst abused of all Ike's patients. He is not the only one that this happened to. There are other people that Ike, in one way or other, took advantage of in ways that would seem to be deeply inappropriate, especially if the patient was rich, I might add. So that's worthy of note. This was not a one-off.
Can you say more about that? The how the financial capacity of the patient was sort of part of what was going on?
Well, it's not always true, but I had somebody recently tell me that father-in-law was a very wealthy person, and Ike was constantly saying, I could help him. You should bring him in. Or he would, with somebody, people would come in for couples therapy, and he would say, not only can I do couples therapy with you, but I can do individual therapy with each of you.
Which any psychiatric trainee is going to tell you, like I've had in lectures, that's an obvious no-no.
Right. So he would see the guy 3 times a week. He would see the woman 3 times a week, and he would see the couples twice a week, and he'd bill them $50,000 a month because he's seeing them so often. So that's one thing. But also, he liked, I asked his sister, and this is something we didn't really get into in the
Marty's
podcast.
Sister.
No,
or Ike's sister.
Ike's sister is the youngest person to have survived Auschwitz. She was 4 years old when the war ended. And she lives in an assisted living facility now in Brooklyn.
And you had a conversation with her that was on one of the supplements, right?
Right. And so this is what I wanted to say about her, that she didn't really want to talk a lot about this, but because she doesn't really get along with Ike. But at one point I said to her, why do you think your brother became a psychiatrist? And she said, well, I think it's because he likes power over people. Now, I should just point out very quickly that most psychiatrists in the modern age are not about talk therapy. They're about medication. Ike was not like that. He was an old-fashioned, he wasn't a Freudian, but he was a talk therapist. And he liked to brag that he took more people off medication than put them on. He was really anti-medication. So when we say psychiatrist, people should keep in mind this is not how many people envision a psychiatrist today. This is like an old-fashioned talk psychiatrist.
I see Dr. Komrad wants to jump in there.
Right. Well, thank you very much. This was a podcast and a story that really was gripping for me. As they say, it ran me up the Z-axis because there was so much provocative there to an ethicist, to a practicing psychiatrist. I do want to say, just before I say anything else, just to address this issue of psychiatrists doing psychotherapy. As a matter of fact, it's not as unusual as you would think. About 40% of psychiatrists still practice psychotherapy in addition to psychopharmacology, sort of a one-stop shopping practice. Interestingly, those psychiatrists often, because of the time commitment to do that and the level of reimbursement these days that come from insurance, often don't take insurance coverage, because if one is under the constraints of what insurance will fund, generally it pushes you sort of in a position of having to see too many patients in one day to be able to give the time necessary to psychotherapy. But about 40% of psychiatrists still do that. So it's not that rare to have talk therapy with a psychiatrist. But getting to the ethical issues here, I think that there are a couple of things that we should really be noting. First of all, I think that we're really here in the domain of the doctor-patient relationship. And in the doctor-patient relationship, there is a really venerable ethical tradition that protects what is fundamentally a vulnerable dyad. And that goes all the way back to the origins of medicine, the original covenantal community, if you will, that established the ethical field in which the doctor-patient relationship exists, goes all the way back to Hippocrates, which was among many ancient hospitals that was part of the cult of Asclepius, the god of healing. But there was something particularly unique about the cult of Hippocrates, and that is that it was bound by a set of values, of particular ideals that were professed by the people who work there. And indeed, this is the origin of the word profession, to profess a set of values. And that made it different than any of the other similar groups in ancient Greece. And indeed, you had to take an oath in order to become part of that community of shared values. And that oath really, in many ways, set up a kind of sacred space, which, although in those years were in the religious context of Asclepius, it really has persisted over the millennia as a notion of a sacred or sacralized space when a doctor and patient engage in the healing activity. And this oath contained certain things that demarcated that space because it was a space of vulnerability. And as such, it needed to be protected. So there were sort of three major elements to protect that space. First was, as part of the oath, it said, I will not give a lethal drug to anyone if I'm asked, nor will I advise anybody else to do so. So the first principle was, when you come in a vulnerable way, sick, in a kind of one down position, I have power over you. So the first thing I promise is I won't kill you. The second was, in the oath, said, in whatever homes I go to, I will enter them for the benefit of the sick, avoiding any voluntary act of impropriety or corruption, including the seduction of men or women. So this is another protection that says, first of all, when I'm there for you, the patient, not for me, not for my own benefit. And as a result, I will not engage in corruption or seduction. In other words, I won't exploit you financially. I won't exploit you sexually. I will not seduce you in any other broader meaning of the word seduction. And what is a seduction? A seduction is an engagement of or a deployment of my power, utilizing the vulnerability that you have for my own benefit. So this is the principle of beneficence. I'm there for you, not for me. And then finally, the oath says, whatever I see or hear in the lives of my patients, whether in connection with my professional practice or not, which ought not to be spoken of, I will keep as secret. So that's confidentiality. And again, because I want this vulnerable relationship to be one in which you reveal your secrets and reveal your vulnerabilities to me so that I can have the information I need for healing, I will protect those secrets. So that's another kind of protection of the sacred space.
So there's these three, so there's these three aspects of the Hippocratic sort of foundation of, I won't kill you, I won't have sex with you, I won't steal from you, and then I'm not going to talk about you.
Right.
And here we have a case where someone did most of those things.
Exactly. And that's the Hippocratic tradition, which has really is the root, the soil out of which the mighty tree of medicine and its the ethical space out of which the house of medicine is built has come down over the millennia.
He's breaking lots of the basic tenets, and sure, he's not having sex with his patient, but he's breaking pretty much everything else. The thing that I'm really interested in here first is, what's the boundary here between ethics and the law? What's the boundary? Because I've had a chance to talk to some peers about this, and what everybody says is this guy should be in jail.
No. The law, most states now have laws against having sex with a patient. Not all of them, but a lot do. But in every other way, what he did, you would have a very, very, very hard time arguing that it was against the law to convince your patient to will a house to the shrink's wife. There is a difference between, unethical behavior and illegal behavior. And the lawyers that we talked to, and we finally sat Marty down with a lawyer who specializes in suing psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, social workers who violate ethical boundaries. And she basically said that he had a really good civil case for medical malpractice, although the statute of limitations had long since run out, and he did it way too late. But that there really was no ability to bring a criminal case. Now, what should happen in these cases is that, the Department of Health, who's ever in control of the ability to license the psychiatrist, should engage. And until this podcast came out, the Department of Health in New York City was deeply reluctant to engage. Now, of course, there's a hearing going on. It'll probably last till early next year about whether Ike Hershkopf should retain his medical license or not. New York division of the APA was about to hold a hearing, an ethical hearing, and his response was to drop out of the APA.
Yeah, let me just say, as somebody who's been very involved in those hearings, both locally and nationally, in those kinds of hearings, that although anybody can resign from the APA at any time, if you are in the midst of an ethics investigation, an accusation, and even a hearing, that will proceed even though you've dropped out, and that if indeed there is a finding that an unethical behavior was committed, that is still something that is reportable when you go to apply for a license and they ask, have you ever been found guilty of any kind of ethical misconduct?
But isn't that not what happened in this case? Didn't he resign and then it went away?
No, not necessarily.
Wait, excuse me, Mark. It actually did go away in this particular case. After he dropped out, the doctor who was the head, who was going to be in charge of the ethics investigation, wrote a letter saying, once this happens, we have no jurisdiction and we're really sorry, but there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, that's not usually the way that it works, I will tell you. So that's interesting. Usually, again, you cannot abort an ethics investigation by dropping out. I do want to say, however, that the fundamental teeth that the APA has is to either reprimand you or educate you or suspend you from the organization. But again...
But none of that's your license.
Right. But he would still have to say, was there ever... answer yes on a license application. Were you ever investigated by a professional society? Or at least was an ethics complaint ever filed against you? And if so, what was the outcome? So you can't entirely escape that with regard to licensure issues.
What, Joe? I'm curious. What do you think should be the punishment here? What do you think should be the process here?
Well, I mean, I think Marty got some really bad advice. He went to some lawyers who were not experts, and they said, there's no damages here, whatever. And they kind of since the 1960s, there is a subset of lawyers who specialize in suing psychiatrists. Now, in America, litigation is how we solve wrongs. So what the two things should have happened. Marty should have sued Ike for medical malpractice, and he would have gotten damages. At a minimum, he would have gotten the $3 million back that he'd spent on Ike all these years. Yes. And then secondly, he should have been more aggressive about going to the Department of Health and said, look, I'm suing this guy for medical malpractice. Here is my brief of all the things he did wrong. Here's my evidence. I demand that you guys do something. And he should have done that, not through himself, but through the auspices of a lawyer, which would have had more impact than him doing it by himself.
So when he goes to the board and says, here's all my paperwork, here's all my stuff, because he did, right, for years, right? He was trying.
He did it. Okay, the first time he did it by himself, and they kind of dismissed it. Then he got his friend. He had an old friend that he reconnected with, who's a lawyer, and helped him rejigger after the APA dropped the case. Sorry there, APA, but you're not perfect on this, baby.
No, and that's important to say that there's a distinction between how things are supposed to work, maybe, and how things actually do work in the
But after the APA dropped it, Marty really got mad. He went to his friend Jeffrey, who was a lawyer. They came up with a much more powerful, including some of the best evidence. And this time, the Department of Health said, okay, we'll take the case. They then sat on it for 3+ years until the podcast came out, and now they're revved into action. So yes, so that's the other thing that needs to happen. Just have a podcast written about the case.
Well, right. That's the thing. So you think that if he had gone with, because the part of the thing about this that bothers me so much is that the only reason that this is moving forward, that we've got a situation where someone who has engaged in, multiple decades of abuse of a patient, right, is only going to be is only going to be held accountable because a New York Times columnist, a Bloomberg opinion writer, happened to move in next door to him and be interested. Right. That's absurd, right? That can't be the requirement for things to move forward, right?
Although let me just go address this issue about law and ethics, because I think this is a dialectic that's important to think about in the context of medical practice. As we're all acknowledging, law and ethics are not the same. They certainly inform one another. Many people have talked about law as ethics light, the difference between what you should do and what you must do. Just looking at the fact that it was once legal to own slaves and illegal to hide them, as, by the way, the recent film Harriet really shows in a very remarkable way. But that wasn't ethical. So law and ethics are not the same. And in medical practice, there needs to be a sense that the patient's vulnerability is protected. But if law reaches in to control every minute aspect of the medical transaction, that can be incredibly stultifying to the deployment of the healing arts.
Well, that's part of the keeping your secrets so that this can be a safe space.
And that's one of the reasons why part of professionalism is making it incumbent upon a physician, upon a psychiatrist, to take stewardship over the vulnerability of the patient, to recognize the paradigm of beneficence in which the doctor is there for the patient's benefit, not for the own benefit, to be able to be scrupulous about identifying that. And that scrupulousness doesn't just involve one's own self-reflections, but it involves collegiality, supervision, consultation, the use of ethics committees, which are a very important resource that are often underutilized in healthcare systems, to be able to check in. And also, of course, medical education. And hopefully the residents that are listening to this podcast have had good exposure to some of the fundamental principles of medical ethics that we tried to touch on in this podcast. So all of that remains part of the responsibility of the physician, just like, you're responsible for keeping your patient safe physically and with your knowledge base, not hurting them with regard to the dangers of the treatments that you're giving in terms of medications or surgeries and so forth. There are also dangers that are inherent in the doctor-patient relationship. And in fact, the code of ethics for psychiatrists that are kept by the American Psychiatric Association really recognize this. Just reading from the APA Code of Ethics, it says that the doctor-patient relationship is such a vital factor in effective treatment of the patient that the preservation of optimal conditions for that relationship should actually should be of prime consideration, and that the physician should conduct him or herself with propriety in that relationship. The necessary intensity, again, I'm reading from the code, the necessary intensity of the treatment relationship may activate all sorts of feelings, sexual, other needs, fantasies on the part of both the patient and the psychiatrist, activate in both the patient and psychiatrist, while weakening the objectivity necessary for control. The inherent inequality in the doctor-patient relationship might lead to the exploitation of the patient.
Well, right. We does.
But this is a point that's brought out in the code itself, just to remind us that we are on very vulnerable territory in general in healthcare, but especially in the intense interaction in the confines, often very private confines, of the psychiatrist-patient relationship.
And from the perspective of a trainee, it's powerful when you experience that for the first time. When you start to experience people really bringing incredible pain that you couldn't predict, right? And sort of putting themselves in your hands. it's a very intense experience. And it's, for me anyway, it's been a humbling experience, right? Which I think is probably what it is for most of us. And that's a good thing, right? You get it, it sort of draws you towards this idea that here are these people who really need help, and I'm in a unique position to be helpful. And that's why I went into medicine in the first place. And what a wonderful thing, right?
And that humility is very protective of that relationship. And unfortunately, for some people, by virtue of their personality traits, they may not show up with that humility, or that humility begins to erode and diminish over the course of a career.
Yeah.
What's very interesting about this particular case, as Joe said, is this really began very early in Ike Hirschkopf's career. Very often when we see cases,
almost earlier than that, it's almost like it's been a trait since he was a kid.
Yeah, and Joe gets into a little bit of that in discussing his past with the family. But most of the cases of boundary violations that we see, interestingly enough, are not naive or green young psychiatrists, who are just getting started and are floundering and, don't have the mojo to maintain those boundaries. As a matter of fact, most of the cases of boundary violations that we see, both financial and sexual and so forth, are in much more experienced psychiatrists who believe that they are smarter, that they have developed, not only the sound basics, but innovative new ideas, that they can take risks that they wouldn't have taken earlier. And as a result, they will step over what starts as boundary crossings in a kind of
which we talk about in training a lot. And I know that came in the podcast too. The boundary between crossings and violations. Right. That's something that comes up. Right. Yeah,
and so that kind of risk taking that comes from the confidence of a seasoned career is actually more of a risk factor than inexperience.
Well, there's also just the amount of time it takes, right? Like if you've been around 25 years and been treating people inappropriately, it's more likely that just by sheer numbers, one of them will come forward and bring a case.
I'd like to step in on that point. I've been thinking about that. So obviously Ike did this to more than just Marty. And I would ask the former patients, some of whom were there 10 years, some 15, some shorter. I would ask them, why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you go to anybody? And they say, look, it's humiliating to realize that you were this guy's captive. It's embarrassing. And there's fear involved. I don't want it to go public. I don't want people to know what happened. And so instead, one of the reasons he gets away with it for so long is because they cut off from him and they go their own way and they try to rebuild their lives, and they just want to put this behind them. They don't want it to drag out. And really, Marty is a difference. Marty was willing to go public. Honestly, I mean, I'm totally, he realized he couldn't sue. He realized he wasn't getting anywhere with the APA or the Department of Health. And suddenly this journalist shows up. And the journalist is his only way of getting back at Ike. I mean, that's really the way he thought about it. And his sister really felt this even more strongly because she'd been deprived of her best friend and her brother for 27 years. And her sister actually said to him, Marty, I don't care if this humiliates you or embarrasses you. You have to do this because it's the only way this guy can be stopped.
And that's all the time we have for this week. Please join us next week as we release part 2 of this fantastic interview with Aaron Winkler, Joe Nocera,